Today on Co-op for Two, a quick spoiler-free review for a new 3-part cold case game called The Duel from BeTheDetective.com. Is it worth your money, and does it offer anything different? Stay tuned to find out. Before we get started, some quick preliminaries. Let's start with what genre this is. We call this a cold case game or a document dump game. That means all of the pieces here are basically facsimile documents, police reports, autopsies, receipts, letters, etc. There's occasionally some use of the internet, but you won't spend most of your time there. It's definitely not focused on puzzles like an escape room game would be. Occasionally there are some ciphers and codes, but those tend to be pretty minimal in these games. And there are lots of examples of this genre in the standard length. Games from the Adventure Crime Stories series, Cryptic Killers, Hidden Games series. Bunch of them that play in 1 or 2 hours each. The closest maybe long-form, multi-part example of a cold case game, at least close to this genre, is the series called Lovely City from A Killing Affair. And I do want to distinguish this from the Hunt a Killer multi-part seasons, which are nearby, but tend to be much more focused on puzzles and ciphers. Okay, so what is The Duel? You order it directly from the website. You can purchase it in single episodes. You can subscribe the way many of these direct mail companies work, but you can also order the full set, which I did. This box contains all 3 episodes. It cost me $90, including shipping, to purchase. That is on the expensive side for this kind of game. You would pay less than that for 3 standalone good cold case games from Amazon, for example. The Duel is the name of this set of 3 episodes. It makes up one story. It's a fairly new release from a new company, a husband and wife mainly company. They've got another case, another season, another story called Welcome to Adventure Park that is just, the first 2 episodes are out. The 3rd and final episode is just being finalized. That may be available within a couple weeks of when this is published in 2023. And then they've got a couple more games in this series under development. I would say in this box, we're going to take a look at what's included in one of the episodes. The first episode is maybe the longest, second episode comparable, and third episode a little bit shorter. If you're interested in watching us play through this or watching it after you play through it, the entire playthrough that I did with others on the channel is available. About 6 hours each session, 3 sessions, so about 18 hours worth of video. Now, it won't take you that long to play the game yourself if you're not filming it, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. It is for adults, this game. I guess if you lined it up next to the other games in this genre, they can sometimes be a little bit cartoonish, sometimes a little more family friendly. Usually they do deal with murder and serious crimes, but this one I would say a little bit more on the adult side than others in its tone and its in the nature of the game. It does make use of the internet occasionally, and you are allowed to go and do general searching for information on the internet, but it doesn't require you to have social media accounts, logins, etc. So let's cut to the chase. Let me give you my bottom line thoughts on this before we dig in deeper. I think from my perspective, there are probably two questions you want to ask yourself if you're considering purchasing this game. The first is it worth the money? Is it worth $90 for a game that you're only going to play through once? And maybe you could get 3 hours per episode out of it. So maybe if you take your time, a 10-hour game for $90. That is not cheap, comparable to going to the movies, perhaps. So I don't think I can give you a direct answer to whether it's worth the money. Only you know what's worth, how much it's worth for you to play these games. I think probably it's comparable per hour, dollar per hour spending, whether you buy a small game, a short game, or this game. But I can help you answer the second question. And the second question I think that's important is one long case a different experience qualitatively than 3 short cases? And my answer to that is yes. Especially for experienced gamers, this is a different experience. It is a richer, more immersive, more demanding, more engaging experience than playing 3 short games. Three normal size document dump cold case games that you would buy on Amazon, even the great ones, and they're great, provides a qualitatively different experience here. This is a much more of a slow burn than those games, and much more sort of realistic in terms of the unfolding of information over time. So if you don't want any spoilers at all, and if you don't want any more information, this would be a good time. You could sign off, stop watching now, come watch the rest when you finish playing it yourself, or you can watch our playthroughs. Now I'm going to spend a little bit more detail going into the game and looking at some of the components and giving you some suggestions for playing the game. Let's open it up and take a look at the contents of the first episode. Now, if you are really against spoilers, paranoid about it, you could use the timestamps to jump around. Although I really think that's overkill here. I'm not going to show you anything that you wouldn't see the moment you open the first episode. And all of your time spent in these games is really concentrating on the contents. So seeing what they are is not a big part of the game. But let's take a look at how this game works and what it comes with. So you get a little welcome letter for each episode, giving you a little update on the case and giving you an assignment, what you're supposed to be doing for this episode. And then you get a little brief set of instructions on how to think about it. You get a list of the contents of the episode so that you can reassemble it. And it's important to note that none of the components of this game get destroyed while you're playing it, so you could absolutely pass it around. You get this big, generous journal, which is quite full of text to read. We get various reports, some drawings, a card, business card, a brochure here, an autopsy form that's got to be 10 pages long here, detailed technical autopsy form with some illustrations. Then we get the first interview here. So there's the contents of box 1. And as I said, I'm not showing you any of the internet pieces of this game, but you will find yourself spending a little bit of time on the internet. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about the pros and the cons of this set compared to similar ones. First of all, let's talk about pros. The documents in this game are unusually long, dense textual documents. A big long journal, tabular data, the biggest medical autopsy report I've seen in any such game. And there is some real enjoyment in going back over these documents repeated times, looking to mine them for information and additional information. Something close to my heart is that the money here in the development of this game clearly went into story and the quality of the textual nature of the documents and not into fancy props, gimmicks. If you play a game like Hunt a Killer, which is the most popular of these kinds of games, you'll very frequently open up one of their boxes and there'll be a hat or a shirt or an expensive little box with a lock on it. And it's clear that there's a decent amount of money going for the gimmicky nature of having these physical props that look like they're expensive, or a bar of soap or whatever. For me, that does nothing. I would much rather have the product be a little bit cheaper and have all the attention be put into creating believable textual documents. And that's what you get here. There are no gimmicks. There are no props to speak of. It's all functional information that's useful for you. And there is some real subtlety in some of these documents and some of the information and the story. Some things that really will require from you that you really pay attention and notice small little details. And you'll be going back over this evidence multiple times. Lots of these episodic games like Hunt a Killer and A Killing a Fair Lovely City and those, they often threaten that once you finish a box, you might need some information or some clues from that box in a future box. But it feels to me like that's rarely the case. They're almost all designed as self-contained boxes, episodes, where you could play one box 1 month and then you just put it on your shelf and you open your new box. Here I feel like there's much more of an emphasis on one big long case here. And I think you will find yourself going back over the previous episodes in trying to solve the assignment for the current episode. And I think maybe that's another reason why it would favor buying all 3 at once as a complete set. Occasionally, some of the items here are the best I've ever seen. For example, the autopsy report is the most detailed medical technical report I've ever seen. Now, is that important to you? Would you rather have a shirt and a hat? Or would you rather have a 10-page medical report that reads as if it was a real report? That you're going to have to decide. For me, I know where I come down. I'd rather have the big, long reports full of technical information to chew on. So on the technical, sort of detail-oriented side, it feels quite special. But there's another side to these games, and again, you're going to have to decide subjectively how important it is for you. For me, a compelling narrative, a well-written dialogue and story is hugely important. It's important to motivate me to want to solve the case, and it's important because there's some real enjoyment out of reading transcripts and interviews that feel real. And there's a buy-in that happens when we play a well-written case where you say, okay, there are real people and real motivations and real psychology at work here that I can use my understanding of to help me understand what would happen and how people would behave. And that's important. When people start behaving in too cartoonish a way in these games, there's a tendency, there's a temptation to sort of bow out and say, okay, this is a cartoonish game. I can't really rely on real human psychology to help me figure out what's happening. And I think this game really comes down on the adult realistic behavior standpoint. And the dialogue, the transcript, interviews feels real. You're going to be peeking into people's personal lives with letters and text messages and interviews. And it feels real. It's adult. And it feels sort of subtle and very emotionally engaging. There are issues here, and when you read them, you get sucked into this world and these people. And if you're the kind of group that talks over these things, what would this person do in this circumstance? How would they react to this information when they discovered it, when they were put in this position? And I think one of the real joys that we had when we played this game is really debating about how would this person really react? What is likely? What is reasonable for them to have done? What should we consider might have happened in this case based on this person's psychology? And the writing is very good. People's personalities feel distinct and different and compelling. And it's all very heavily motivated. It motivates you to want to solve it. Okay. I've already said that this game does not require you to destroy anything. You don't have to work too hard for that. It's not like you'll have to make detailed scans to fold things and cut things. I would say of most of the games we play, this might be on the least end, on the easiest end to pack up when you're finished and pass along. It even includes a note listing what's in each box to make it easier. There are no puzzles here, and frequently if you play a game like Hunt a Killer, you can see Hunt a Killer is sort of a hybrid, riding the midpoint between true puzzle games like Deadbolt Mystery Society or Escape Room games, and then the pure narrative cold case games. And Hunt a Killer is somewhere in between. It is a cold case document dump game for the most part, but then there's some real busy work doing occasional puzzles and lots of ciphers and codes. And I am not a fan of the whatever decision making goes on in the Hunt a Killer design offices of how much work to make these codes and ciphers, and they just don't feel that fun to me. Here, there are no puzzles. There are a small use of codes and ciphers. They're not handled amazingly. I would say they're the weak part of the game, but they're minimal. And in general, the game does not rely on too much busy work. I think another thing in favor of this game is sort of the staging of the episodes. So some of these multi-part episodes follow a very stereotyped pattern. It's like you start out the game and it says, here are 6 suspects. And then each episode you sort of winnow out one of them. Hunt a Killer follows this commonly, and Killing a Fair Lovely City, Independence Day Killer did this a bit too, where it feels like it's following a very set sequence of actions. Here, each episode feels like you're not exactly sure what you're going to be tasked with, and each episode feels quite different. It's almost like it has its own little style and format, and changes up the pace of how things work. And I found that very satisfying and intriguing. And I have said, but it is worth repeating, that this game does reward you for going back through previous episodes and not just sticking with the same one, and going back and rereading the earlier documents. But it's never in a painful way. You never feel like, oh my God, I don't want to have to go through that again, looking with a fine-tooth comb for stuff. It's always enjoyable. The documents are realistic and compelling enough that it's fun to go back through them. Let's talk a little bit about the cons of this, the parts of this game that didn't work as well as I might have hoped. If you watch our 3-part playthrough, what you'll find is that we're having a great time on each episode right up until the end of the episode, when we have to answer some questions to move along. And you use a website for that. You do need to use the website to finish the end of an episode. And it's sort of a 2-part end. The letter for each episode tells you what you have to do, like you have to find these two things or eliminate this person or whatever. So you go to the website, it's kind of in two parts. One part is wants you to solve two objectives or three objectives. And for each of those objectives, you can get some hints. And the hints are okay. They're not the best. I think ideally it would be nice to have a little bit more fine-grained hints so that like the first time you just click hint 1, hint 2, hint 3, you click hint 1 and it gives you some information and maybe you needed it or maybe you didn't. Maybe it's giving away too much. You can't just say, oh, what did I not quite understand? Let me click here. They leak information, some of the hints. And almost all the objectives are like hint 1, hint 2, here's the solution. Now, if you pay attention to that web page at the end of each episode, you'll see there's a little icon at the bottom, a little pipe. When you click that, you get into a sort of AI-driven chat where you're asked questions. Now, the letters mention that little feature, but it's sort of hidden, and it's a little odd because it feels to me like that little Q&A should be front and foremost and separate from the hint system. But the Q&A thing was not ideal either. It's interesting because mechanically it works. It basically will ask you a question like, who do you think should be excluded from consideration? Who had an alibi? Or what do you think happened to this object? Whatever. And then it asks you a question and it presents some multiple choice and it frequently gives you a bunch of choices, but sometimes even just the listing of those choices is leaking some information. And then interestingly, what typically happens after you make your choice, like this person is excluded, they couldn't have done it. Then it will ask you, what evidence convinced you of this? What evidence would you use to prove this? Which I think is a great thing. We've seen it used in a couple other cold case games, and it's quite good because sometimes you intuitively guess who didn't do it, but you are not sure how you would prove it. And what's nice here is the game will say something like, what 3 pieces of evidence proves it? And frequently, we got to a point when we were answering these questions where we said, wait a second, 3 pieces of evidence prove it, where maybe we had found 2 or maybe we found 4. And an interesting thing happened at that point. The positive part about it is it frequently led to some very interesting discussions and debates about what evidence really would constitute proof for a certain assertion. The unfortunate part about it was, in addition to leaking some information, is that a bunch of the questions seemed very odd to us. And I don't want to give anything away and get into spoilers, but essentially what happened to us frequently during the game is it sort of ground us to a halt where we were saying not what do we understand about the case. Frequently we felt like, okay, we understand all this evidence, we understand the case, but the question is being asked in such a weird way, such an unintuitive way, confusing, convoluted way, that we didn't know exactly what the game was really asking from us. And there were certain ambiguities in the game or with evidence, and we felt like the game was forcing us to make a choice that we had no logical basis to make. And it was just weird. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about suggestions for playing the game, but I think this is going to divide some groups. I think there's a kind of player where the whole enjoyment of the game rests on the satisfaction of the questions and answers and their score. This game doesn't give you a score. You're just taken through the case. You're trying to answer questions, but no score. And then there's a different kind of player that is much more interested in the journey and having interesting discussions. And I think for me, one of the reasons why this game worked so well and why everyone in our group that played it really enjoyed it is that the discussions were really valuable, interesting, deep, meaty discussions. Even over the questions, which frequently we weren't thrilled about, led to some interesting discussions. Okay. Another area that we had a little bit of complaint about was that there were a couple pieces of evidence that were sort of presented out of context and without enough information about the piece of evidence. Sort of its, what would you call, if someone gave you a piece of evidence, you could kind of take it in two ways. One way you could say, well, it's a game, there's a reason you're giving it to me, so I'm going to make certain assumptions about it, about its pedigree, about where it came from, that make sense because we're playing a game. And then you could look at it and say, well, I'm trying to treat this as a realistic game, and so maybe I shouldn't trust that this is a piece of evidence that I can really use. Maybe I shouldn't make assumptions about it. And we had a couple pieces of evidence in this game that we disagreed about how much faith we should put in and how we should treat it. And I think that's not ideal. I think it was weird that we were given a piece of evidence without any background about where it came from and what it exactly was. And I think that was a little bit of a miss. There were a couple of, when you make such a big game that's so hard to play test, we've come to expect that there are occasionally going to be typos, grammatical errors, whatever. I would say this game is has very few, maybe less than normal, but it does have a couple of typos in areas that might be slightly important, like a date that might be wrong. And I think some groups are more sensitive to that than others. I've come to just look on those as maybe difficulty modifiers, difficulty multipliers. They just make the game a little bit harder because you're always wondering, well, could it be a typo in this police form about this date? Or how we have to use our judgment to decide that this thing we're looking at is a mistaken date. But again, your mileage is going to vary on that and how sensitive you are to that. And I think maybe the last part, and again, all of these games are so subjective, so it's very hard to know exactly what kind of experience you're going to have on any given game. Depending on how you go into it and your group, you may have quite a different take on it by the time you finish it. But I think, especially if you just play this solo, it's possible you'll get to the end and feel like, well, I don't buy it. I don't buy this part of the ending, and that threw off my whole theory of the case. And I think, this comes down a little bit to how you approach these games. What is it really all about? Are you really going to play a game for 12 hours and then you're going to decide that your enjoyment of the game is broken based on the final detail that pushed you into one theory and another, but the game had a different thing in mind? And I think it's possible when you get to the end of this that you may not be thrilled with the solution. But I think if you take your time and enjoy the ride, that's not going to be a huge big deal. Maybe you'll love it. It's hard to say. But keep an open mind when you go into a game like this that it really is about the journey. Final thoughts. For fans of this genre looking for a more epic, long experience, this really is something quite special. I don't know of any other game, any other really pure, long-form cold case game. And it really is a very different experience to play one long one versus 3 small games. I do recommend that you have some experience with this genre before you take on something like this. A couple of suggestions for those who do want to try it. Take your time, for sure. Of course, take notes and all that. But really, take your time and appreciate the subtlety of the details of this game. And maybe don't limit yourself to the questions that the game asks you to solve. Like, take on a harder challenge. Take on the bigger picture of understanding everything. Try to work out everything that's going on. And pause before you answer questions and try to paint your own picture of what happened. I think with these kinds of games, and especially with this one, if you just stick to the strictly questions that are asked of you and say, well, I don't know about this stuff, but the game hasn't asked us to figure that out, I think you'd be missing something. I think maybe you take on the challenge of understanding everything that happened. Make up your own theories of how things unfolded before you read the solutions. And like any hard game like this, you really will benefit being able to talk to your group about your theories. Take breaks in the game. Say, okay, let's stop. Let's put this down. Let's take a walk. Let's spend a half an hour just talking about our theories before you just rush through it. You will get out of a game like this what you put into it. If you do play the game, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear if you want to post in comments to this video any places you disagree with me, what your favorite parts were. You might even considering after you play it, watch through our live playthrough, see where we went off the rails and you didn't, or where you were thinking something different than we were, especially maybe at the ending. I'd love to hear your take on the ending of the game if you finish it. If you want to see more content like this, either the reviews or the playthroughs, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. If you know of a game I haven't covered, I'd love to hear about it, and I'll see you on the next video.